You guys are probably familiar with all these. You got prop state lifecycles, hooks, component composition, HTML, and CSS. These are all things that you can use in your components. And oftentimes you'll see in early days of React, you'd see presentations and they'd say, hey, you can put your state with your view and all these other things. But then you get a messy component, and then it becomes harder to test, harder to maintain, and harder to use. So I'm going to show you guys how once you take these apart and you start separating them out, it becomes a lot easier to maintain components and to make them clean. So you'll always hate yourself 2 hours if you haven't been writing maintainable code. If you've ever written any code that you didn't write really fully, you'll probably know pretty soon after you built stuff on that, and you built more stuff, and eventually that went to production, and then sadly, now you can't change it, and you're stuck with that crap that you wrote. So this is something that's plagued me before too, and it's something that is important because we want to know how to maintain our components. The entire reason we're here to find out about clean React components is maintenance. That's probably the most important thing. You got other people coming in the company, they got to figure out what's going on. That's a cost to the company. You got yourself coming back to the code base. That's another cost. So these are all why you want clean React components. And now let's take a look at an example component that I wrote in 2015. That's going to be where most of this talk centers around because it has so many bad things about it. This is before I became a professional React developer. It was the very first project I did, and it was redoing my game's website with React. So it's this little piece here with the little play icon and the text. Let's see if I can get my cursor. Yeah, so it's this thing up here. So that is the component. Seems pretty simple, right? Play stop, some text, no big deal. But it's not, and that's where we're going to show how to make it clean. OK, so this is the entire component. It's 346 lines. I put it out in different columns just so you could see it all on one screen. We'll go through it step by step. So this is the top part. You got imports, right? There are unnecessary comments in here. You don't need this part that says actions or utilities or anything like that. That's not really useful. And then something else you'll notice here is the styles loader. This was done quite a bit ago before there was any kind of CSS and JS. So I had to create my own solution for this. So this is like just some different piece of it. And then we've got the constructor. There's a finite state machine going on here, it looks like, with this stuff. And these are also static values, but they're assigned to this. They're not static properties on the class. Also, I noticed that like the names didn't make as much sense. Icon, parent, icon. This doesn't really tell you that these are class names. OK, so another thing here in this is these lifecycle functions. These are actually fine. There's not too much going on here. And then we've got helper functions, or as I call them, helper functions. In fact, all of these functions can be removed completely. And I don't mean removed because they're like extra or fluffy or something like that. I mean removed completely because there are better ways of doing this than putting them in the component itself. There's no reason for any of these to be here. So we've also got a click event handler, which I named handler, like handle playback. So this is actually pretty big. We're going to shrink this up and get rid of it. There's not really any reason to put it in this component. And then we've also got extra render functions. So if you're looking here and you're seeing these are HTML, and then they're being passed in as functions over here into our main component. Now I did this in the past. I thought it'd make it look cleaner. I was like, hey, now my component's just this little thing with a couple of function calls. The problem is these probably should be other components. You're just causing indirection. There's nothing good here. And then there's another thing, Redux Connect, right? You guys hate this thing, right? You got to write an HOC at the bottom of your file with map state to props, maybe even map dispatch to props. This makes your components really messy. But here it is. It's also in this component. In fact, this is the first time I used Redux. And the first time I used this component, I didn't even use Connect. I didn't even know this was a thing. I subscribed and unsubscribed from the store manually in the component. So this had a revision at some point in time. And if you notice here, these two are thunk style, but there was no thunk. I didn't know about Redux middleware, so I wrote side effects into the actions and then called the dispatch afterward. So this was my own implementation. So let's get some side-by-sides. This is where we're going to start fixing things. The very first thing is our default export. If you see here, what I did was I spaced it out. I made it easier to read. There's actually another HOC here, but I'm not going to pay attention to that. And then notice how this is all one line here. That's important because it's hard to merge this. If somebody makes a change, somebody else makes a change, that becomes difficult to figure out what went wrong. In fact, it's not even fitting all on my screen. Now, maybe people code with like one window open in the whole widescreen. But the thing is, I usually code with multiple windows side by side, and they're very skinny. And so it's a lot easier for me to read the one on the right than the left. Now, I get that might not be everybody. That's mostly a style thing. But by also naming this here, connected song, it makes it easier to search for, because you won't know that there's a component named connected song wrapping all those other, that song component. You won't see it in your DevTools because there's no name attached to it. In fact, hot reloading doesn't work properly if you export it like here. It has to be done like this. Now, I had a plugin that did it for me in Babel in the past, but that's something important to know. Now, another thing, we've got prop types. Seems pretty simple, right? You got this prop types here, but there's a missing semicolon. So something most people don't know is that static properties on classes need to have semicolons. ESLint used to not error on this. It does now. Babel still compiles it like no big deal, but this was an issue I didn't even know about. So it's a syntax error. And pulling your prop types out above the component actually makes it easier to read because it matches your function components. Now you don't have two ways to do it. Like, think of if somebody comes and joins your company and you're like, hey, okay, we're in this component, we're going to put the prop types here, but in this component, we're going to put the prop types here. That becomes a lot of stuff you got to keep in your mind. So instead of that, separate them out, make it easy for everybody, and just pop them in here at the bottom. That way it's always the same. And you won't have the syntax error sometimes from people who maybe didn't use class components and they're working in an older code base now. Pure component. Did you guys know that pure component and should component update don't go together? They changed this at some point in React 16. In the past, you were able to do this, but it's kind of weird because pure component has a should component update function. That's really important. So if you override it in a pure component, it doesn't actually do anything anymore, which is correct. That's how that should have worked in the first place. So what I had to do is rewrite this. Now, something else I did is that this.props part, I got it and moved it up at the top. And I'm consistently doing that in every function. The reason for that is, one, that matches my function components, but two, it also makes it easier to read the code. Now you don't have this long string that you got to go move your eyes across the entire code window just to see. And then another thing is, on the return statement, I also put parentheses here. The important part of the parentheses is that it sees that as a segment, something that's being returned. Because when I looked at this code the first time, I actually missed this or statement here. I was like, in my head, I was seeing it like a comment. Because it was at the bottom of a return statement, there's nothing supposed to be there. So I didn't even notice it. So that's why I put it in parentheses. Now, I do that all the time, but this is also a reason where it became an issue, not doing that. If you guys know about static values, usually you would put those as static class properties. They would be, static, and then you put those values in there like icon, icon parent. What I did is I actually renamed them to icon container class name and icon class name. That makes a lot more sense because they're class names that are pulled in based on the player state. And another thing I did was take these ternaries here. If you look on the left here, we've got these ternaries, a couple Boolean values, playing stop. You got to look way over to the right side of the screen just to see the playing and stop. So what I did is I pulled them out and I put them right underneath. So it's a little bit easier to see there. But the important piece is what I did up here is I took these out. These are completely out of the component. Now it loads once, and it doesn't need to load every time the component loads. It's not a big deal. It's not a huge performance impact, but there's really no reason for them to be in the component. And finite state machine. So I use these all the time. I even use them in my current job. I have to use finite state machines because true and false is very difficult for other coders to figure out what you're trying to do. Sometimes it makes sense. I could have is playing, and then stopped is false, right? You would assume that's the case, but you don't always know. And in this case, there's actually a paused that's in the reducer. And I was just rewriting these finite states here in this component. Eventually, I'll show you that they got put back in the reducer where they should have been in the first place, because they were there. There was another one. So where it says playing and stop, there's actually a paused. Well, how do you add paused to true and false? You got null. I mean, when you have Booleans, yeah, you can do tri-states. The problem is it's very difficult to know what all the states mean. And so one of the best ways to get around that is to use finite state machines, where you have named values, like enums, essentially, on the state. Now, our language, JavaScript, doesn't have a great way of doing enumeration. I think there's an official way to do it now, and there's another way you can use symbols or just objects, because they have different memory references. But the easiest way is to always use strings, because anybody getting in there can run the debug tools, and they can figure out what that's actually doing and what state it thinks the component is supposed to be in. So another thing I did is I added this playback state piece here. Eventually, I got rid of this whole piece. It doesn't even need to be here. This component doesn't need state. But when we were doing the pure component part earlier, I forgot to show you I renamed this to component from pure component. So now we can have state in this component. It was originally stateless. So remember, this was 350 lines of stateless code. And so what I'm doing is I'm setting the state, and I'm setting playback state to the same logic that we originally had in these two functions. So now it's only in one spot, and it gets set, and then these things are listening to the update the component is listening to the update to state, and when it gets updated, this part gets re-rendered. Another thing down here is, notice where it says icon container class name. That's just taking, that's like an object, and I'm passing in player name to get the property off of it, or playback state. So in the past, what we had is we had a function call, right? I was calling a function get play icon parent, get play icon. Instead of those functions, I have these objects here, and you just pass in the finite state to get what you need out of it. And so this is an easier way to figure out what's going on, because the player state is a string that gets passed in the component, and you can just pull it off the object that way. So separating components, that's another thing that's important. There's too much going on in here. You got a lot of indirection, right? Like we talked about this just a second ago. These render functions, I know you guys can't see them probably. These are two render functions, and then there's a bunch of HTML here at the top. They should all go together. It should all be one big thing. But even still, if you were going to have functions like that, they should be separate components. So what I did is I'm going to show you as an example, because I didn't actually end up doing this. I'm going to show you an example of how I pulled them out into separate components. One thing is I renamed them. So the function says like render playback icon, render song info. I named it song information, and I also named it playback icon. Okay, well that's the same. And then I have the playback icon pulling stuff from state as well, from Redux. Is map states to props. I know that's probably hard to see. Let me see if I can zoom that for you. Okay. Yeah. So map state to props here. This is also interesting because instead of pulling back the props out of Redux exactly, what I've done is I've used our finite state machine to return back that playback state here. Now originally this is actually another finite state machine with the paused piece, but it's all lowercase and it's not exactly what we want. So without touching Redux, I'm going to clean up this component just using map state to props for that piece. And then at the bottom here, we have our song player. I renamed it from song to song player. That makes a lot more sense. And then also we're passing in song.artist, song.title, song.subtitle instead of passing in ... song. The reason for this is if you guys pass in ... in some object, if that object has props you're not expecting, that'll cause your component to re-render every single time one of those changes. You wouldn't even know it. You won't have any clue why it's changing because these props are ... dotted on, meaning now your component is aware of extra props that it should be watching that you don't even want it watching. Another thing is you always want to be explicit, because if you're explicit where you're passing in song dot something, now you know exactly what props on that object you're pulling off, and that's really important because you don't want to have other coders come into your project, see like, oh, animal is passed in, and you have no clue what an animal is. Man, this is like some deep object, got a bunch of props on it, and you're pulling off all these things. You have no clue where they're coming from. So what this does is it flattens out your object into something that is obvious to you, makes it easier to check, and makes React more work correctly when the props change. Oh man, that's weird. Okay, so HTML and CSS. We had this BEM style before in CSS here. Now, originally this was named song, but I pulled out this component, right? This was named song here. I renamed it to song information, the exact same formatting as the title of the component. That way, when I'm looking through the code, if I see CSS in there, I can just search it, and I'll find the component associated with it. It'll be very easy to find. Also, what I did is I hit the Enter key. So that's why these are out here on the left. Before, I had to go all the way to the right to catch it. They're not even aligned. I would have no clue those are here. If I was looking at a pull request, I'm just skimming through it, I wouldn't even know to look at these because there's a bunch of lines of stuff, and I was like, yeah, it looks like HTML. You know? But over here, now I can see exactly what I'm pulling in, and I can look for any errors that might be coming in the code. So this is important. Also, notice my Boolean check here. Normally, you would have to also check for null, but you don't have to do that if it's not the only component. So I just use and short-circuited it there. This is a lot easier for me to read because I can see that there's a Boolean check happening, the way that's formatted. Usually what I've seen is that the and or the or is on the very right side. And what happens is you'll miss that. You'll just see some value and then a bunch of code. You might not even notice that there's an and on the right there. So this is another thing that you might want to do for readability. Okay, styling. One of the things you can do, this is not a great example. I'm going to show you one after this of something I've actually done. This is an example I did just to show it off, where you can have a styling component. The component is literally there to wrap a div around your thing and add a class to it with style information. So I've done this before, where you might have something that's common. Like these three all had the word song information description on them. And I created a component for that. Now, it's really doesn't make any sense here. It just adds a lot of indirection. But in bigger components where you might be using this all over the place, it makes sense to have a class wrapper component that also itself takes a class name. That way you can override its functionality if you need to. Because a lot of the time you want to do that. Even where I'm working right now, we're redoing all the components and creating a component library. It's important to know that we have that class name on there, because if we can't override it, we're going to have to then add it anyway. A lot of the time, maybe the default styles aren't exactly what you want, and you can't really get around it because of how HTML and CSS works. So that's very important as well. And the last thing here is that if you look at the class name part at the top, it has the equals quote quote. I'm using that as my default props. That actually works with Storybook and Docs. You don't have to have a separate default props object to be able to do default properties like this. So you could just put it in your function definition at the top here. And also, you probably noticed, I'm kind of skip over this a lot, but I hit the enter key on all of my object props. And the reason for this is because I alphabetize them so that they're easy to find. A lot of times I've noticed there's like a big long list. It looks like this. And then people have actually duplicated values in there. And they've even said defaults on some of them. And the defaults are getting overridden. And so when you have like an input, for instance, and you're making your own text input, that often happens a lot where you have tons of props in there. And when you start putting them out and out, then they start wrapping, and then people don't even know that, oh, this prop was actually in there originally. And then they re-add it, and then they override something, and something else breaks. So that's another reason why I always hit the enter key here and put every single one of those on a new line. The reason is because it's easier for people to see it, it's alphabetized, and I can default props very easily on there by just putting equals and then putting some default value. So that default value is an ES6 thing. It only works if it's undefined. If it's null, it won't do anything. So just keep that in mind. And then a styled list component. This is where I probably would have used it, where you got like medical documents coming in from Ajax call, and you're passing it in as children. And then over here, I'm checking if children is an array or a single item. And then I wouldn't need to check it here if it's coming from Ajax, but this is how I wrote this a long time ago. And then there's a styled list, and there's a styled list item class. And so these two are united. Maybe there's like a display flex or CSS grid or something where I want the children to be aware of whatever the stuff is on the parent. And so I would want them in the same component. I don't want two different components, both with their own CSS files. And I don't want two components sharing a CSS file either. That's going to be something not people are going to be expecting. So I put them in the same component here, and then I'm looping over children. And for every child, I'm wrapping it here and then putting it in this component. Also, I have this ID prop name. The only reason for this is a little bit of a helper. So if you really care about the ID on that object, you can pull it off and make it the key with this code. So that way on the right here, you don't have to have that map function. And on the left, you can have that in this component that gets composed on the right. Okay, Redux integration. So we want to make it obvious that props come from Redux. If you guys are using Redux, you probably know this. You have a bunch of props in your component. You don't even know where they're coming from half the time. I didn't know. I had no clue. I was looking at this component. I didn't know that these 4 props came from Redux. So that was a bit startling for me. So when I came in, one of the things I was thinking, I was like, okay, how do I do this? Well, I actually changed all this together where this was unnecessary. And we'll get to that. But another thing I tried, other than just putting a comment at the top and saying like, hey, this is Redux and these are React props, was prefixing it with the word Redux. And I don't like doing that because it ties Redux with your component props, and they really shouldn't know about each other. In fact, your component should be just completely like, oh, Redux, I don't know what that is. And so there's a better way to solve this, but I want to show you one other alternative I thought about, which was creating a Redux state object. I don't know if you guys can see this. Okay, so there is a Redux state object I created, and I put the props on there. That way I could know, hey, these are coming from Redux. The problem with doing that is that the connect function for Redux is pure, and it only shallow checks props. So if you do an object in your map state to props, what's going to end up happening is it'll always re-render your component every time state updates, which is probably the worst thing you could have. Because I get like a lot of state updates from Redux. And so the last thing I want is my component just randomly firing updates all over the place, causing my app to slow down. So you don't want to do an object in there either. And the other 2 examples at the bottom are just using the prefix with Redux. And so what I did was I created a state container. So one of the things is, you can pull out styles, right? In this case, we're actually going to pull out state from this component. All of this on the left, it's kind of hard to see, but it's component will mount, should component update, handle playback, which is our toggle playback click event handler. And then we have is current song and is song playing. These all can be moved into this component on the right, which is a state component. In fact, this entire UseEffect portion can be removed, but I wanted to show you it just for good measure. So this is what I had come up with for a stateful version of a component that does not render any view information. So if you look here at the top, this is a selector. So this is it's called select song playback state. So this will go through, this is our map state to props essentially. And we're going to use hooks to get this. But it's the same as map state to props. We have an object here with is currently playing song, with playback. We're going to pull that off the object, and we're going to create a property called is currently playing song. So instead of doing this stuff at the bottom where you had is playing song, is current song, and their functions, and you're checking booleans in them, instead of doing that, what we're doing here is we've just got them. We've got an ampersand here. We're doing our boolean check inside our selector so that the value that's being passed to props is something that we actually care about, is something that we know. So instead of doing that logic in the component, we moved it to a selector function. And then our component now is called song playback state. There's song player. This is the song playback state component. We're going to use render props to pass the values into our component. I'll show you how that works in a second once we go through this. So notice up here we've got dispatch, right? There's a use dispatch function. This is a new hook in React. And there's also below it a use select function. So we got our select function to select something out of state. This is the same as a map state to props. And we're going to use select and use selector and then pass it in there. And then we're just pulling off that is currently playing song prop. And then I used a UseEffect hook here. I'll explain why I had to remove this. But UseEffect is a function that gets called every time your component mounts and updates. So on first mount and every update after that, it calls UseEffect. UseEffect also takes a return value. The return value is another function. It calls that before your component updates. So the first mount, it calls the UseEffect function. Then let's say an update comes through. It'll call that return function to unmount your component and then recall the UseEffect again. And so the way you control when this happens is by passing something in at the bottom here. So for instance, if I didn't pass anything in, it would just do it at when the component loads and when the component unmounts. It's the exact same thing as component will mount, component will unmount. But if I want to have a should component update, then I can add a variable at the bottom here of this array on UseEffect. It's the second argument to UseEffect. And what it does is it allows me to say when this value updates, go ahead and rerun that UseEffect function. Now the problem here is this stops the song, this code here. And every time is currently playing gets updated, meaning even if it says playing, it will stop the song. So this code ended up having to get removed and moved up a level into the list of song players. So there's a component that contains all of the song players, and that component now controls when it's removed, the entire audio player stops, instead of having each little song component having to worry about that logic. So that ended up getting removed. But down here also I want to show you, I'm using something called CreateElement. I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but if you've seen React compiled out, there's a function called react.createElement that Babel puts in there. All your JSX gets replaced with react.createElement. So if I see children here is a function. So I'm passing it in with, this is a way to do render props. I'm passing children in as a function. If I just call children and pass in child props, the problem is that it won't show up in your DevTools. You won't even know that that got rendered. It's just calling a function. Even your error catching and stuff won't work like you expect because you're not rendering children. You're calling children as a function and adding that HTML into this component. So what you want to use is CreateElement, just like React does behind the scenes in JSX, so that you can create a new component that way. And my child props, something interesting here is we had this handle playback function. It was a click event in the previous component, the old version. But now I've created it, I've renamed it to toggle playback, and it's a function that gets generated for this song. And because it needs a song ID, it has to get generated every time. But the important thing is this comes through render props now. So before, this was part of my component. I had this giant component with lots of stuff in it. Now I've pulled this out. This is a stateful component, but it only pulls state from Redux and then passes it on to the child. So your child doesn't even need to know about Redux. It doesn't need to have any clue of it. And I can be unit testing that separately. So that looks like, oops. Like that, or no, not like that. Definitely this one. Which you probably can't, no, it's this one. So this is what it looks like when you use it. So before we had the song, and I know this looks like a lot more code. It ends up not not being that bad because this is more composable. It's one of those 7 things I talked about. So what we did is we kind of separated this out. Now we have song playback state and song player. These are 2 separate components. This is render props right here. So this component, song playback state, takes a function as children, not children. And in that function, it will pass us playback state and toggle playback. Now you guys didn't see the playback state part. That wasn't in there because it was too big for the example. So I added that later. But this toggle playback part, we saw this before. And so that's how song player can manage state. It gets a callback function called toggle playback. When you click it, that tells it to start or stop the song. Now the logic's kind of weird here because Redux should be really doing that logic behind it, play song, don't play song, that stuff. But at the time I didn't have Redux middleware knowledge and I didn't put anything like that in there. So the problem is that I'm working with existing code and this is the best way that I can separate that out. And this is probably a situation you guys will be in the same boat. If you're ever wanting to make clean React components and clean up stuff, refactor, you're going to have to work with what you have. You can't just go through and redo state and redo Redux and do all that. So you have to work with what you've got, and this is what I've been doing here. Also notice, like I said, we have song.artist, song.subtitle. I'm being explicit about all the props that are passed in, so you can just look at song player and you should know what to expect to go in there. So the final product, oops. Let's see what time is it. So I was going to show you some side-by-sides of the final version. Oh, this is going to be really hard. Okay, so this is the original. We saw this before, if you guys remember this. It's really long, got a bunch of extra functions that's not needed. So I'm going to show you the new song player component. Okay, now we're at the bottom. So this is the song player component. Most of the stuff at the top is the same, a few less imports and no comments at the top. And then, oops, over here where I have these icon class name things, they're using player states dot playing player states dot stop. So instead of putting the strings directly like I had before, I'm tying those to the object itself with the finite state machine. So that way anybody looking at this can know, okay, when you're in this state, this is what's supposed to happen, not what the heck is playing, what the heck is stopped, where does that come from, how does this even work? And they're also outside of the component as well as the prop types, which now the playback state is a prop, and this property is one of the keys of playback states, because playback states is an object, so we're getting the keys off it, and the keys are playing and stopped. So this is important because now whoever passes this in, it's not just a string that I care about. I care about if it's one of these 2 values in the string. Somebody passes in the wrong thing or something happens weird, I'll know about it now. There's also a song player, right, like we had before. And if we notice, this is a lot cleaner. Just look at this. Just some HTML there. That's it. Nothing. We're using the objects here and passing in playback state. So that's where our icon's getting the play or stop icon. Still doesn't even have to know about state, this component. And then toggle playback is our on-click action. And that's it. Other than changing the CSS, there's not much that changed here other than what I showed you earlier. And so it's important, look, not even any Redux here. This is a lot cleaner. This component has become something readable, something clean, something reusable, maintainable. I can unit test this one in like a few seconds because there's only 2 props that change. It's the toggle playback, which I don't even know if I'm going to, I got to test that when you click it, that gets called, okay? And then I got to test that if the playback state is in the started position or the playing position, that the icons change to playing. That's it. There's nothing else to test now. And then we also have song player or song playback state. This was the stateful component. Now, like I said, use props was gone. So this looks a little bit different. There's more coming out of our selector here than was before, but it's pretty much the same as we had before. There's very little that changed except for the whole UseEffect part is gone. This component is now a lot smaller as well, if you see it. This is a lot smaller of a component. And then something else I did was I moved playback states to a utils file in the reducer because the reducer is actually the one that cares about these playback states, and that's where I'm pulling it from. These are all in the same directory. I had a big reducer before. It was called playback. It followed the Dux model, if you guys have heard of that. The Dux model is where you take your actions and your reducer and your action creators and you put them all into one file. And the problem is this gets like a big file. If you look at this file, look at this thing. I mean, there's a lot going on in here. I got in here, I was like, dang, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I was doing. So I separated it into 4 files. They're all in the same directory. And the benefit now is that they're all in things that make sense. So these are like get audio player. Okay, this creates an audio player if you're not on Node.js, and go through and then put that and add the event listener to stop the thing after and then return it. Great. Now I'm done. This was very simple. Selectors. This is our selector function. There's only one. Select playback states. It got changed name, and then right here, as you can see, I'm putting in there's a few more things going on in here than we had before. Before we were just looking at is like song currently playing. Now we're looking at is current song, is playing song. The way the state works is weird for this particular part of Redux. I didn't want to go back and change all of the functionality. I just wanted to change a little bit about how the component worked. So this is very minimal in how I changed everything. Like I said, also the other thing I did was make these capitals before they were lowercase. Nothing too game breaking. And something else I changed here, if you look here, my actions were called pause, play, and stop. Well, I renamed them to pause song, play song, and stop song because I've done epic work in the future now. And so I know that these actions might be pulled in somewhere else. And I don't want two actions that say play or something. I want to know exactly what this is supposed to be doing just by looking at the variable name. So that's why I've changed it. And then I can't remember, there's one other thing that changed. Yeah, I added this is playing song to my reducer. That's just some extra property I added where it wasn't there before. But now as you can see, we have playback states. Before these were lowercase in the reducer. Yeah, and they were called music playback states. So I just renamed it playback states. That makes a lot more sense since this is the playback reducer. And then I set them to stopped or playing depending on which state this is in. And notice there's also a pause here, which we didn't have in the previous example because the component didn't care about it anymore. It used to, but it doesn't anymore. Okay, and then there's nothing else with this particular piece. So let's look at what we had. So we had these 7 things I talked about. We have props, right? We moved the props out of the component for a class-based component. It would have been there anyway for a function component. And then now we're being more specific. We're specifically saying which props are going into the component, and we're hitting the enter key after that so we know which props are coming into the component when we're on our function. And then also, states moved to a separate component. That was something interesting. So instead of putting state and view data and all that together, the state's completely gone somewhere else. So we don't even have to worry about it. Life cycles got replaced by UseEffect, even though I ended up getting rid of that. Life cycles can get replaced by that. That's a really nice, slick way of doing them. So we used the hooks called useDispatch and useSelector. These are currently in the latest version of React Redux, or Redux. Yeah, React Redux. So that's the thing with that connect function that you guys saw. You can completely get rid of that connect function by using these two. In fact, this is the same method that I used before for render props at my previous company. I had to write this myself. Now they come with hooks, so you can just use them that way. Component composition, guys. You remember that render props piece where we had the stateful component and it was passing render props? That's how we got our composition here. So before we had one component, now we have two, and we can compose that state anywhere we want. That song playback state can be used on any component now, not just song player. So if there's something else somewhere else in the code base that needs it, you can also compose it on that. You can also wrap that component with this as well, and it can just get the state very easily. We added HTML, new lines to our HTML to make it a little bit more readable. We changed our CSS from BEM style to a JS style where we were using camel case, and we were using the variable name in the front to namespace our CSS classes. So if we don't namespace our CSS classes, something important is that when you have a global CSS file and you have CSS all over the place, there will be conflicts in your CSS. You don't want that. You don't want something, dot title to be used everywhere. You want to have it specific to that component because otherwise you're going to run into conflicts and you can't refactor and you can't change it because this one depends on this one that depends on this one, and this is used in like 5 places. You don't want that. What you really want is classes specific to just that component. So what I did is I always namespace them, and I always put the first class in the component as the name of the component. Everything else there, underscore something, underscore title, underscore artist. And then lastly, we have used a separate component for our styling. That was as an example. We didn't end up doing that. But you can remove styles from your component as well if you really need to for some reason, where they can be in a separate component that then wraps all your other subcomponents, and you can compose those as well. So clean React components. It reduces complexity. It removes the awareness of state from most of your components. This is a thing you can do to clean up your components. You can make them self-documenting this way because song player and song playback state make a lot more sense than song. And then you can significantly make them easier to unit test and maintain. And that's one of the most important things for me, is how quickly can I unit test something, how quickly can I maintain it, how easily it's going to be for somebody else to come in after me and start making changes. Now, it might take a bit for them to figure out, how everything's working, but instead of having one giant component with a bunch of functions in it that didn't even need to be there and a bunch of extra code, we can remove all that, put it in different places, and have it be something that people know where to go. So like if I want to know where I'm getting something out of state for Redux, I would go to the selectors file. If I want to know where my actions are, I go to the actions file, right? If I want to know where a component is for a view component, then I just go to that component, but maybe there's a stateful component wrapping it, and it says the word state in the name. I can go find it and go use that. And I can use it wherever I want, because I can expect, like, this is getting the state from somewhere that knows about it, and then passes it into whatever I care about as children. So, questions? And I think we're at time.
Thanks, Kevin.